Hey there, my name's Charles, and in this video, we're going to connect our virtual networks together and continue on with deploying the Zero Trust network for our web application. So we've already got, in the previous video, we got our Key Vault set up, we got our two virtual networks deployed, one for a hub virtual network, one for a spoke virtual network, and now we need to connect these two networks together. And to do that, we will use virtual network peering. Then once we have the two networks set up and connected to each other, we can start to deploy our actual web app. The first thing that we'll do and in today's video is deploy the app service. So this will be the PaaS Azure service that's running our web application, running our code, and getting that up and running so that then we can put the security services in front of it. So hope you enjoy. Please like and subscribe the video as well as to the channel if you want to learn more about Azure. Let's jump right in. So this is our diagram. Again, if you watch the prior video, we should have our resource group set up as well as our two virtual networks with the subnets in. So now what we'll do in today's video is set up the VNet peering, the connection between the hub and the spoke virtual networks, as well as deploy our Azure app service that's going to run our website. So we'll continue on with the documentation. We'll pick up here in deploying the virtual networks. So the next thing that we need to do is add in our peerings. Now the Azure portal makes this pretty easy to do. It used to be a couple years ago that you had to set up each peer direction independent. So if you think of, maybe going back to the diagram, from the hub network to the spoke network had to be one connection that you set up, and then you had to set up the inverse for it to be bidirectional. So you'd have to go to the spoke network and then set up the connection to the hub network. The Azure portal has been updated since that was originally introduced. Now you can do both simultaneously at the same time, and it's pretty easy to set up. So we'll take a look at the walkthrough here, kind of see the settings that we need to think about when we go and configure this. For each direction, for the hub to the spoke, and then the spoke back to the hub, there's kind of three main configuration items that we can set. In this case, we're going to leave the defaults in that we want traffic to be able to access, from one network to the other network, and then vice versa. So we're going to set both of those to allow. We're also going to allow forwarded traffic. That way, as we set up the third piece from, say, the app gateway all the way to the app service, that traffic would communicate. And in our scenario, we're not using any type of VPN or express route, so we don't have anything to configure there. And then it'll be the same. So this is the hub to spoke side. The same page just does the inverse, the spoke to the hub, and it'll be the same exact settings. So let's go over to the Azure portal and get this configured. We will go to our virtual networks, select the hub VNet that we previously created, go to peerings, and then we will add a peer. And so this first peer, and so this is where this page is kind of broken into those two different sections, the two different directions of the peering connection. So the first header here, this virtual network, meaning the hub VNet, since that's what we clicked on or navigated to. And then the second section is the remote virtual network. And so in this scenario, this would be the spoke network. And so we'll call the first connection hub to spoke. So this is one direction of the communication. Again, kind of allowing the defaults. We want to allow traffic to the remote network, allow forwarded traffic, and we're not using any type of VPNs, so no virtual network gateway. And then the inverse would be the spoke to the hub. Now this is another way that the Azure portal makes this a little bit easier. If you're doing this from a script, command line, maybe bicep, you would need to know the resource ID. This would also be the case if the other virtual network was not in the same Azure subscription. Maybe you're working with a partner or a vendor or something. You're trying to set up connectivity across subscriptions. You would need to know the resource ID. But with everything in one subscription, the portal makes it easy. It gives you the subscription in just a drop-down menu, so we can just kind of search for the spoke network and select it, and we don't have to do anything fancy there. And then same settings, we want to allow traffic to be sent to the remote network as well as forwarded, and we're not using any gateways. So we'll click add here, and this will go and set up the bi-directional communication. So from the hub to the spoke, from the spoke to the hub. It shouldn't take but a minute or so. We'll refresh this, and the connection between these two virtual networks should be in place. Now, behind the scenes, all this is really doing is creating like a static route between the two networks. If you watched the first video and saw the IP address spaces that we added to the virtual networks, the hub network is a 192.168 address space. The spoke network is a 172.16 address space. So theoretically, they're two completely different networks, logically separated. And so what the peering connection does, we'll hit refresh here, and so now that shows up as connected. What this peering connection does is add in the static route behind the scenes to say that, well, to get from the spoke to the hub, use this connection. And then to get from the hub to the spoke, use this connection as well. So we've kind of created that static route behind the scenes for these two virtual networks. So that's creating the peering connection. So now these two networks could communicate with each other. Now for the rest of the deployment in the Zero Trust web app would be to deploy an Azure DNS zone. And so again, this is where, assuming that we've bought or purchased a public DNS name, some type of domain name, website name, and to be able to use our certificate, that public trusted TLS certificate, we need to have a domain name that's going to match that certificate or match the name that we use there. In this scenario, I already have a DNS zone set up because I use the same domain name for multiple demos. So I've already purchased and deployed hugelab.net. That's a DNS zone that's already created. And so in your scenario, whatever DNS or domain name that you purchase, if you're going to use Azure to host the DNS, the name services, you would need to come in here and add this DNS zone for whatever domain that you purchase. And then go through the verification steps to verify that you actually own that domain name. So that part's already been done. We'll skip kind of this first part in the tutorial, but this does need to match what you've actually purchased and what your certificate is going to be mapped to. The next thing in the tutorial is deploying the Azure App Service. And so this is where the web app is going to be deployed. This is essentially our code base, maybe our container if we're using containers. In this scenario, we are just going to select code. We'll just go with kind of the latest LTS version, which is .NET 6. We'll put it on a Windows container behind the scenes, and then just create a new app service plan using the standard S1 plan. Just keep it kind of simple for the demo. Obviously, in a production environment, this should probably be a premium plan, or something that would support additional deployment slots and backups and things like that. So we'll go back over to the Azure portal, go to App Service, App Services. We'll create our app service. We'll put it in that same resource group that we used for the other resources. The web app name, copy and paste that from the documentation. Notice that the name here does put a default domain name, .azurewebsites.net is part of the name. So you might need to customize this. If this still already exists, you may need to randomize the number. It is a public DNS name, so it has to be globally unique. That's also true for the key vault that we created, that you might have to use a different name. And as part of our steps, we said we were going to do a code deployment. We were selecting .NET 6. That's our LTS version. Windows operating system, East US. And then we're going to create a new app service plan called Zero Trust App Service Plan. And make sure that that's just, for the purpose of the demo, just a standard S1, pretty entry-level basic app service plan. We're not going to customize this any further. We're just going to create this app service as it is. We will come back and customize the networking in a moment, but I want to do that kind of separately. So we're just going to create the web app so that we can get it up and running and see the deployment there. This may take a minute or two to deploy, and then we'll come back to it. All right, so our web app is deployed. The first thing I just want to do and make sure is that it's up and running correctly. So if we go to the web app, we'll see the URL here. This is the name of the web app that we provided, .azurewebsites.net. If we copy that over and just test it out, we should be prompted with just kind of, hey, look, your web app is up and running, waiting for your content, for your code to be deployed to it. But this kind of proves that, okay, our app service on its own is up and running. And now we can continue on with the next steps to get it secured. So we'll go back over to our tutorial here. Now what we're going to do on the app service is add a private endpoint. And so this will restrict, like right now we can, as we just saw, get to the website publicly. So it's publicly accessible, it's on the internet. And what we want to do is, going back over to our diagram, is create this private endpoint and put the app service on that app1 subnet that we created in the Spoke virtual network. And so now, if we remember, our app1 subnet is 172.16.1.0. And so what this will do is, instead of having the app service directly on the internet, publicly accessible, we're going to put a private IP address on the app service. And so the app service will actually kind of live in this app1 subnet. And so it'll be on the 172.16.1.0 network. So the tutorial has us go in to networking. We'll go to private endpoints, and we'll add a private endpoint on the Spoke virtual network in the app1 subnet. So we'll go back over to the Azure portal. We're on our web app, our app service. We'll go to networking. Under inbound traffic here, right now, you'll see this is the public IP address of the app service. So that's what we used to connect to it just a moment ago. And we're going to click on private endpoints and then add an express connection of a private endpoint. So we're going to call this endpoint private endpoint-app service. We're going to put it on that Spoke virtual network and the app1 subnet. And then we will select OK. And so now what this is going to do is add that private IP address. It'll do so dynamically by default. So it's just going to grab the first available IP address that is in that app1 subnet. And so it should wind up being 1.4, 172.16.1.4. And then that's the IP address that we would use from then on to access the app service internally within the virtual network. So we'll give this a moment to deploy. Might take just a minute. All right, so our private endpoint has been deployed and is kind of associated with our app service. So what this has done is created a network interface card, essentially. If we select the private endpoint here, we'll see that it created a network interface. So it created a NIC, a network interface card. If we select the NIC, we'll be able to see the IP address that it pulled. And so now the private IP address, as expected, is 172.16.1.4. And so this network interface is then associated with our app service. Going back to the diagram, this private endpoint, this network interface, is associated with our app service. Now the app service is accessible using this private IP address. So we'll go back over to the Azure portal. Or actually, we'll go to the documentation, make sure there's nothing else. That was the last step in that section. And so now, just to kind of show you what else here, if we go back to the networking tab, you'll notice that the inbound IP address has changed from that public IP address that was there to the private IP address. And so now if we try to go access our app service again, I'm just going to do hold, shift, and refresh. Now we can't get to the website because it no longer has a public IP address. It only has that private IP address. So that's getting the peering set up. Just going to go back to our diagram. We've got our virtual network peering set up between the two virtual networks. We deployed our app service. We deployed a private endpoint, a network interface card, on the app service and associated it with our app1 subnet. And so now that app service kind of lives within the spoke virtual network, would only be accessible from within the virtual network. So that's this video. Again, if you learned something new, you want to see more, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and thanks for watching.